4 months ago, I started down a rabbit hole. A pretty deep rabbit hole. I'm not entirely sure how I came to the point where every other suggested YouTube video was about fashion history, but here we are. I came across a channel by a Polish woman named Karolina Zabrowska, who has had a large influence on my interest in fashion history these past few months. I watched a video by her entitled "Why We Stopped Wearing Hats," which was my inspiration for this speech. So today I'm going to talk to you about why we don't wear hats anymore. I will talk about the things Karolina talked about in her video, as well as some things I did some further research on. People have been wearing hats for much of the Earth's history. However, the 1900s held one of the biggest revolutions in fashion history ever, especially for women. They were used for practical reasons, shade, warmth, etc., social reasons to let people know your social status, as well as religious purposes. For women, the last century started with hand-sewn, full-length dresses over petticoats and corsets and elaborate hats, and ended with this. For men, it started with black or gray suits, white collared shirts and top hats, and ended with any colored suits, any colored collared shirts, try saying that 10 times fast, and no hat. Hats were one of the many things to change with women's fashion and one of the few things to change with men's fashion. One thing is for sure though, no one wears them like they used to. So let's look at where it all started. World War I. World War I was the beginning of the decline in hat wearing. The vast majority of people still wore them, but with everything going on in the world, it wasn't quite a sin anymore to not wear your hat. When you are working on the farm and dealing with a husband and 2 sons at war, not sure if they're going to return home, then making sure you're wearing your hat and that it is in place and pinned in right and not making your hair look funny is just the least of your worries. The Great Depression, starting in 1929, about 11 years after World War I ended, wasn't much different. I'm not sure why, but Karolina didn't mention the Great Depression in her video. However, I think it's important, so I'm going to talk a little about it. With money being tight for everyone, there wasn't enough to buy the most fashionable and recent styles. They might still wear their old hats, but they probably couldn't afford to buy new ones. Again, a national/worldwide crisis meant you could be forgiven for not wearing your hat every once in a while. World War II had the same effect as World War I, but the result was larger because hats were already declining. Even with everything going on in the world at the time, cities being bombed, children evacuating, etc., Karolina says, and yet wearing hats was still such a basic aspect of life that people chose to do it even in the most difficult conditions. Younger people, however, wouldn't wear hats as often as others, especially in the summer. After the war, there was a bittersweet reaction towards wearing hats. On one hand, women were glad to finally be in a position where they can keep up with the latest fashion hat trends again. On the other hand, the war made them realize that hats weren't that important, which carried into the 1950s. And with men, well, many of them didn't want to wear hats anymore because they were required to wear them during the war, and hats reminded them of the hard times, as fashion journalist Matt Pomeroy said. In the 1960s, fashion changed a lot. While fashion designers were having a hard time figuring out where to go next, they realized a new target: teenagers. With younger people as the new target for fashion instead of adults, skirts were getting shorter, silhouettes were all over the place, and so were the colors and patterns. People were no longer being governed by the laws of fashion, they were doing their own thing. Carolina says, because suddenly the point of fashion wasn't to be elegant anymore, it was to be cool. Hats were doomed. Elegance wasn't cool anymore, and neither were hats. This is about where Carolina ends her video on the history of how hats went out of fashion, but I am not quite done yet. Because upon doing more research, I stumbled upon a very large reason we no longer wear hats today that Carolina didn't touch on at all. And I'm not gonna lie, I felt a little betrayed. But I think the main reason she didn't include this vital information to why we don't wear hats anymore is because her main target audience is women. All the research I did only showed this reason that I will mention in just a moment, as only pertaining to why men stopped wearing hats, but I feel it's important to why both men and women stopped wearing hats. Cars, I think, is the biggest reason hats went away. Many people think JFK is the reason men don't wear hats today. This is because every president until him wore one to his inauguration. While Kennedy wore one on his way there, he took it off before the actual event. And it should be noted that after that, more men than ever, including balding men, began to go without hats. Radio and TV journalist Robert Krulwich, however, thinks that Dwight D. Eisenhower was really the president who de-hatted America. In the 1950s, Eisenhower built a highway system across the nation. Before this, people would walk to work or take public transportation, both of which had lots of headroom. Now with highways connecting more places, people could get jobs in other cities and use their own cars to get there. If they didn't already own one, they could buy one for this particular purpose. Cars were invented in 1885, however, they only slowly became widely available to the public. Because cars had lower roofs that made it so one would have to take off his or her hat as soon as they got in the car, made hats less practical as more people bought cars. Because cars had lower roofs I already said that. I'm sorry. Fashion journalist Matt Pomeroy said, looking at U.S. figures, in 1920, less than 1% of the population owned a car. By 1940, that rose to around 1 in 4 people. By 1970, it was 55%. Hats weren't as sensible as they used to be when people would have to walk to work in them, in the sun and the rain and snow. Now with cars, they can brave the elements for a few seconds before being safe in their cars on their way to work. In short, hats weren't practical anymore, and they didn't fit in with the new looks that teenagers were after. These days, it's head-turning to wear anything other than, let alone fancier than a baseball cap or beanie. But even those people don't wear very often. And as much as I personally would like to see people wearing these again, I don't think it will happen. Rip hats.